The first time I saw a human, I thought they were the most pathetic creatures in the galaxy. My name is, and I am a warrior. We stand 8 feet tall on our worst days, our chitinous armor can deflect plasma fire, and our forearms can crush steel with ease. We have conquered 17 star systems and brought order to a chaotic galaxy. When the Galactic Council needed someone to deal with the growing Vex threat, they called us. What they didn't tell us was that we'd be working alongside humans. I remember standing in the briefing room on Station Omega-7, looking down at this small, pink creature that barely reached my chest. The human wore simple fabric clothing that wouldn't stop a child's toy weapon. Its skin was soft and exposed, with no natural armor or protective plating. It had only 2 arms and moved with what seemed like clumsy, inefficient steps. "This is Commander Sarah," announced General, my superior. "She will be leading the joint operations against the Vex." I couldn't hide my confusion. In culture, leadership belonged to the strongest. This human looked like it could barely lift our standard-issue rifle, let alone lead a military operation against the most dangerous enemy we'd ever faced. The Vex had appeared 6 months ago from the Outer Rim. No one knew where they came from, but they consumed everything in their path. Entire planets went silent within days of first contact. Their ships were massive, organic-looking things that seemed to heal themselves even as we shot them. Their ground forces were worse shape-shifting nightmares that could mimic any form and infiltrate any position. "Commander," I said, using the human's rank but making no effort to hide my skepticism, "perhaps you could explain your qualifications for this mission." The human looked up at me with these strange, small eyes. Unlike eyes, which were large and designed for scanning multiple threats simultaneously, human eyes were tiny and pointed straight forward. How did they even survive with such limited vision? "I've been fighting the Vex for 3 months, said simply. "My unit was on the colony world of New Geneva when they hit. We were the only ones to make it off-planet." 3 months? I had been training for warfare for 3 decades. My people had been perfecting combat techniques for 3. This creature claimed 3 months of experience made it qualified to lead us. "How many in your unit?" asked. "Started with 200 Marines," replied. "Ended with 12. The numbers were staggering. A 94% casualty rate would be considered a complete disaster in any military operation. Yet this human spoke of it matter-of-factly, as if it was simply another piece of data. "The Vex learn fast," continued. "Every tactic we used they adapted to within hours. Standard military doctrine doesn't work against them. You need something else." "And what is that something else?" I asked, genuinely curious now despite my skepticism. Was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a strange quality I couldn't identify. "You have to be willing to do things that don't make tactical sense, things that go against every military manual ever written, things that are." She paused, searching for the right word. "Crazy," she finished. This was not encouraging. Military doctrine was built on logic, efficiency, and overwhelming force applied at the optimal moment. The idea of deliberately acting in an illogical manner went against everything I had been taught. Over the next few days, I observed the human preparation methods, where warriors would spend hours in combat meditation, focusing their minds for battle. The humans engaged in bizarre rituals. They told jokes. They played games with cards and dice. They listened to what they called music, rhythmic noises that served no apparent tactical purpose. I watched during these preparations and noticed something odd. The other humans looked to her not with the respect through fear that subordinates showed their commanders, but with something else. They trusted her. More than that, they would follow her into obvious death without question. This was puzzling because she was not the largest or strongest among them. "Why do they follow you?" I asked her during one of our joint planning sessions. "Because I brought them home," she said. "All 12 of them. When everything went wrong on New Geneva, when the Vex overran our positions and cut us off from support, I got them out. Through superior tactics." Laughed, a sound that seemed inappropriate given our circumstances. "Through pure stubbornness and a lot of luck. Sometimes that's all you have." This concept of luck as a tactical factor was foreign to me. Strategy eliminated variables whenever possible. We planned for every contingency, prepared for every scenario. The idea of deliberately relying on random chance seemed like madness. Our first joint mission came 3 days later. Intelligence had located a Vex forward base on the mining asteroid 442. The base was relatively small, only a few thousand Vex units, and would serve as a good test of our combined capabilities. The plan was straightforward. Heavy assault units would establish a perimeter and engage the Vex in direct combat, utilizing our superior armor and firepower. Human units would provide tactical support and handle any infiltration attempts. Clean, logical, efficient. The plan lasted exactly 17 minutes. We dropped onto, in the pre-dawn darkness, our assault craft landing in perfect formation around the Vex compound. My unit, Talon Squad, took point whilst Marines covered our flanks. Everything went according to doctrine. The Vex were waiting for us. Later analysis would show they had detected our approach hours before we arrived and prepared accordingly. But in the moment, all I knew was that the ground beneath our feet suddenly erupted in a maze of organic tunnels, and we were fighting for our lives against creatures that shouldn't have existed. The Vexon weren't like the reports we'd studied. These were new variants, some tall and spider-like, others low and fast, all of them wrong in ways that hurt to look at. They moved in patterns that made no tactical sense, attacking from impossible angles and melting away when we tried to engage them directly. Within minutes, our perfect formation was scattered. My squad was split into 3 groups, each fighting isolated battles against enemies that seemed to know exactly how we would react to every situation. That's when I heard's voice over the comm, calm and steady despite the chaos around us. All units, forget the plan. We're going with Protocol 7. I had never heard of Protocol 7. It wasn't in any of the joint operation manuals we'd studied. What's Protocol 7? I shouted back, while using 2 of my arms to fire at a Vex creature that was trying to flank my position and my other 2 arms to reload backup weapons. Do something stupid, came's reply. Before I could ask what she meant, I saw the humans begin to move. Instead of maintaining defensive positions and laying down covering fire as doctrine demanded, they were advancing. Not just advancing, charging directly into the heaviest Vex concentrations, firing as they ran. It was complete madness. They were outnumbered and charging into certain death. Every tactical manual in existence would classify this as suicide. It worked. The Vex had been adapting to our logical, predictable responses. They had learned to counter our standard formations and expected movements. But they had no framework for understanding pure, reckless aggression that ignored all tactical considerations. I watched Marine Corporal Jackson sprint directly toward a Vex cluster form, firing his rifle on full auto. When he ran out of ammunition, instead of falling back to reload as any sane warrior would do, he drew a simple chemical explosive and charged the remaining distance. The explosion took out the cluster form and 3 smaller Vex units. Jackson didn't survive the explosion, but his sacrifice opened a gap in their lines that allowed 2 other Marines to flank a larger Vex position. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. Humans making impossible choices, sacrificing themselves in ways that created opportunities for others. Not through careful planning or tactical brilliance, but through pure, unreasonable determination. I found myself adapting to their methods without consciously deciding to do so. When a Vex shapeshifter took the form of my squad leader and tried to infiltrate our position, instead of following proper identification protocols, I simply shot it. When 3 Vex hunters cornered Sergeant Williams, instead of calling for backup and waiting for support, I abandoned my position and charged them directly. The way would have been to maintain defensive positions, call for orbital support, and eliminate the enemies through superior firepower. The human way was faster, bloodier, and completely unpredictable. It was also effective. Within 2 hours, the Vex base was destroyed. Our casualty rates were higher than any commander would accept. We lost 30% of our forces. But we had achieved something no military unit had accomplished before. We had completely defeated a Vex position without allowing a single enemy unit to escape and report our methods. As we regrouped and prepared for extraction, I found tending to one of her wounded Marines. She was using human medical techniques that seemed primitive compared to regeneration technology, but she worked with careful precision. "Your Protocol 7, I said, is that standard human military doctrine?" Looked up from her patient. There was something in her expression I was beginning to recognize, a kind of exhausted determination that never quite faded. Protocol 7 is what you do when everything else fails, she said. When the textbook answers get your people killed, you throw out the textbook and try something else. Even if that something else makes no logical sense. Especially then, returned her attention to the wounded Marine. The Vex are logical. They learn patterns and exploit them. If you want to beat them, you have to be willing to do things that don't fit any pattern. I considered this as our extraction ships arrived. The human approach went against everything I had been taught about warfare, leadership, and survival. It was inefficient, dangerous, and relied far too heavily on factors outside anyone's control. It had also just saved all our lives. Over the following days, as we prepared for our next mission, I began to study human methods more carefully. Their training exercises seemed chaotic compared to drills, but I noticed they were designed to prepare soldiers for situations where standard procedures had failed. They practiced improvisation, adaptation, and decision-making under impossible circumstances. Most interestingly, they trained their soldiers to continue functioning even when afraid. Warriors were taught to eliminate fear through discipline and mental preparation. Humans seemed to accept fear as inevitable and focused on acting effectively despite it. Fear keeps you alive, explained when I asked about this difference. It makes you pay attention to things you might otherwise miss. The trick isn't getting rid of fear, it's not letting fear make your decisions for you. This was a completely foreign concept. Fear was weakness. Fear was the enemy of clear thinking and effective action. How could these creatures consider it beneficial? I was about to learn the answer to that question in the worst possible way. Our second mission took us to the planet 3, where Vex forces had established what intelligence believed was a major staging area. Unlike the asteroid base, this was a full-scale invasion. Force estimates suggested over 50,000 Vex units of various types. The joint task force assembled for this mission was correspondingly larger. 3 assault battalions, 2 human marine regiments, and support units from 6 other member species of the Galactic Council. It was the largest military operation mounted against the Vex since they had first appeared. I was assigned as liaison between my battalion and regiment, which meant I would be working directly with human forces throughout the operation. After our success on 442, I was looking forward to seeing how their methods would scale up to a larger engagement. The initial assault went better than anyone had dared hope. Our combined forces established multiple beachheads on 3's surface and began systematically clearing Vex positions. Human unpredictability paired with firepower proved devastatingly effective. Within 6 hours, we had secured nearly 30% of the planet's surface. Then we found the hatchery. The Vex hadn't been using 3 as a staging area for existing forces. They had been breeding. The complex we discovered stretched for miles beneath the planet's surface, filled with thousands of gestating Vex forms in various stages of development. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were gestating into new variants specifically designed to counter every tactic we had used against them. Variants with armor that could deflect plasma fire. Variants that moved in the same unpredictable patterns the humans used. Variants that seemed purpose-built to exploit the specific weaknesses of every species in our task force. "They've been watching us," said as we stood at the edge of the hatchery complex. "Every battle, every engagement, they've been learning and adapting." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Every victory we thought we had won had actually been a learning experience for the Vex. They had been allowing us to succeed just enough to study our methods and develop counters. "We have to destroy this place," said Colonel Martinez, superior officer. "If these new variants reach maturity and spread to other Vex forces." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Every species in the galaxy would be facing enemies specifically designed to kill them using their own methods against them. The problem was that the hatchery was too large and too well-defended to destroy with conventional weapons. It would require a team to penetrate deep into the complex and plant charges at critical support points. A suicide mission, since there would be no way to escape the resulting collapse. "I'll take my squad in," I volunteered immediately. This was exactly the kind of mission warriors trained for a glorious death in service of a greater cause. "No," said quietly, "this one's ours." I stared at her. "Commander, with respect, this requires precise placement of charges in a hostile environment. Engineering training and armor would provide the best chance of success." Armor won't help you down there, replied, pointing to readouts from our reconnaissance drones. The new variants include ones specifically designed to penetrate chitinous plating. Your advantages become weaknesses. She was right, though I hated to admit it. The Vex had studied us too well. Besides, continued, humans are better at the kind of improvisation this mission is going to require. When everything goes wrong, and it will go wrong, you need people who are comfortable with making terrible decisions under pressure. That's when I realized what I was seeing in her expression. It wasn't exhaustion or determination. It was fear. Pure, cold fear of what she was about to do. But she was going to do it anyway. I'm coming with you, I said. That's not necessary. I'm coming with you, I repeated. Protocol 7, remember, do something stupid. Looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Gear up, we go in 1 hour. As I prepared my equipment, I found myself thinking about fear in a new way. I had always believed that courage meant the absence of fear. But watching and her Marines prepare for a mission they knew would kill them, I began to understand that real courage might be something else entirely. Real courage might be feeling the fear and acting anyway. The descent into the hatchery began in the darkest hour before dawn. S team moved through the Vex complex with a fluid efficiency that seemed almost choreographed, but I was beginning to recognize the careful improvisation behind their apparent chaos. When Vex defenders appeared, the humans didn't engage them directly. Instead, they used the environment itself as a weapon, collapsing tunnels to redirect enemy forces and turning the complex's own structure against its inhabitants. The Vex build their installations like living organisms, explained as we made our way deeper into the complex. But that means they have the same vulnerabilities as living organisms. Hit the right pressure points, and the whole system collapses. It was an approach that required intimate knowledge of Vex biology and construction methods. Knowledge that could only have been gained through careful study and direct experience. These humans had been fighting and learning for months, while the rest of the galaxy was still trying to understand what the Vex were. We reached the first charge point without major incident, but as Sergeant Williams began setting the explosive device, alarms began echoing throughout the complex. The Vex knew we were there. How long for the charges? Asked. 4 more points, 15 minutes each, Williams replied, but only if we don't run into trouble. The sound of approaching Vex forces suggested that trouble had already found us. What happened next would change my understanding of human nature forever. As Vex defenders closed in on our position, S team didn't retreat or take defensive positions. Instead, they did something I had never seen any military unit do before. They split up. Martinez, take Williams and get to point 2, ordered. Jackson, you and handle point 3. Foster, you're with me and on point 4. Commander, we should stay together, I protested. Divided forces. Divided forces mean if one team gets caught, the others can complete the mission, cut me off. This isn't about getting everyone home alive. This is about making sure the job gets done. I had heard similar words from commanders before, but there was something different about the way said them. She wasn't accepting casualties as a necessary evil. She was planning for them. As the teams separated, I followed and Fostered deeper into the complex. The Vex presence grew heavier with each level we descended, and I could hear the sounds of combat echoing from other parts of the hatchery as the other teams encountered resistance. At point 4, Foster began setting charges while I established a perimeter. The work proceeded smoothly until we heard Williams' voice over the comm, strained and urgent. Point 2 is secure, but we've got problems. New variant Vex, some kind of shapeshifter that can mimic equipment as well as personnel. They're using copies of our own weapons against us. This was worse than we had expected. The Vex weren't just adapting to our tactics. They were stealing our technology and turning it against us in real time. Points 3 and 4 be advised, transmitted. Verify all equipment before use. If it looks too good to be true, shoot it first and ask questions later. Copy that, came Jackson's reply, followed immediately by the sound of weapons fire. Foster finished with the charges at point 4 and looked up grimly. That's all I can do here, Commander, but we've got a problem with point 5. Point 5 was the critical structural support for the entire hatchery complex. Destroying it would bring down the whole installation, but it was located in the deepest part of the complex, surrounded by the highest concentration of Vex forces. "How bad?" asked. "Bad enough that whoever goes down there isn't coming back up," Foster replied. Nodded as if she had expected this. "Then it's my job." "Commander, no," Foster protested. "Send me, you're needed to coordinate." "The mission succeeds or fails at point 5, said simply. "That makes it command responsibility." I listened to this exchange with growing amazement. These humans were arguing over who got to die for the mission, not trying to avoid sacrifice, but competing for the privilege of making it. "I will handle point 5, I announced. Both humans looked at me in surprise. "With respect, your armor won't." "My armor may not help," I agreed, "but I am expendable, you are not." This was true from a tactical perspective. His knowledge and experience were irreplaceable. Foster's technical skills were essential for the remaining charges. I was the logical choice for a suicide mission. But shook her head. "Nice try, but you don't know the Vex well enough. Point 5 requires someone who can improvise when the plan falls apart, someone who can do stupid things on purpose." Before either Foster or I could object, she was moving toward the access shaft that led to the lowest level of the complex. "Give me 15 minutes, then trigger all charges regardless of what happens." "Sarah," Foster started. "That's an order, Marine." And then she was gone, disappearing into the depths of the hatchery like she was taking an evening stroll instead of walking towards certain death. Foster and I made our way back toward the extraction point, but the 15 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. We could hear combat throughout the complex as the other teams finished their work and attempted to reach safety. We could hear his voice over the calm, and professional as she reported her progress toward point 5. "Contact with multiple Vex variants," she transmitted. "Nothing I can't handle." Then a few minutes later, charges set, beginning timer sequence. And finally, point 5 complete. All teams execute extraction, I'll catch up. We all knew she wouldn't catch up. Point 5 was too deep, too heavily defended. But we also knew that the mission would fail without her sacrifice. Foster and I reached the surface just as the charges detonated. The explosion was visible from orbit, a chain reaction that collapsed the entire hatchery complex and destroyed every Vex variant in development. The potential threat to the galaxy was eliminated. But Commander Sarah was gone. In the aftermath of the mission, as we gathered casualty reports and prepared our official documentation, I found myself thinking about what I had witnessed. The humans had accomplished something that should have been impossible. They had identified and neutralized a threat that could have doomed every spacefaring species in the galaxy. They had done it not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through pure, stubborn determination to succeed regardless of cost. And they had done it while terrified. I realized that the fear I had seen in his eyes hadn't been weakness. It had been awareness. She had understood exactly what she was walking into and had chosen to do it anyway. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was afraid and did it regardless. That, I was beginning to understand, might be what made humans truly dangerous. Not their weapons or their tactics or their unpredictability, their willingness to act in spite of fear. Their refusal to let impossible odds determine the outcome of a situation. As I filed my report on the 3 mission, I made a request to my superiors. I wanted to remain attached to human forces for future operations against the Vex. I was beginning to suspect that working alongside humans would teach me things about warfare that no military academy could ever provide. Things about fear and courage, and the difference between the two. Things I would need to understand if we were going to win this war. The memorial service for Commander was unlike anything in my experience. Instead of the solemn ceremonies that marked military funerals, the humans gathered in what they called a wake. They told stories about, shared memories, and even laughed at times. It seemed inappropriate until I began to understand what they were really doing. They were keeping her alive in the only way they could. "She hated Brussels sprouts," Maureen Williams was saying. "Back on New Geneva, we found this abandoned greenhouse full of vegetables. Everything else was picked clean, but there were still Brussels sprouts growing. Took one bite and made this face like she was trying to swallow poison." The other Marines laughed at this memory. Even in their grief, they were finding moments of joy. It was a very human response, one that my people would have considered undisciplined. But I was learning that human discipline was different from ours. Where warriors achieved focus through emotional control, humans seemed to achieve it through emotional acceptance. They felt everything: fear, grief, joy, anger, but didn't let those feelings control their actions. Captain Martinez approached me during the service. He had been promoted to Phil's position, a responsibility he clearly didn't want. He said quietly, "I need to talk to you." We stepped away from the gathering and Martinez handed me a data pad. "Sarah left this for you. Said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you got it." The message was brief, recorded shortly before our mission to 3. If you're watching this, then point 5 went about as well as I expected. I want you to know that working with you changed how I think about courage. Warriors face death without fear, and I always admired that. But what you did on 3, choosing to stay with us even when it meant abandoning everything you'd been taught about tactics, that was a different kind of courage. You were afraid, just like us, but you stuck around anyway. That's the kind of partner anyone would want in a fight. Take care of my Marines. They're going to need someone who understands both kinds of courage. The message ended there, but it left me with questions I wasn't sure how to answer. Had I really been afraid? And if so, what did that mean about everything I thought I knew about myself? My contemplation was interrupted by an emergency alert. All personnel were to report to the briefing room immediately. When we assembled, General looked grimmer than I had ever seen him. "Intelligence has identified the source of the Vex incursion," he announced. "Long-range scouts have discovered a massive construct in the Andromeda region, approximately 50,000 light-years from here. Initial estimates suggest it's the size of a small moon and appears to be the central hub for all Vex operations." The holographic display showed images that hurt to look at directly. The construct was clearly artificial, but built using some kind of biological technology, that easy classification. Organic curves intersected with geometric patterns in ways that suggested intelligence, but not one that operated by any logic we could understand. "The construct appears to be creating Vex forces at an exponential rate," continued. "Our estimate that within 6 months, they will have produced enough units to overwhelm every defense we can mount." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a war anymore, it was a race for survival. Either we destroyed the construct before it could complete its production cycle, or every inhabited world in the galaxy would fall. "The mission parameters are simple," said. "A joint fleet will penetrate Vex space, reach the construct, and destroy it using every weapon at our disposal. Expected survival rate is approximately 0%. Around the room, I could see the various species represented in our task force processing this information differently. The officers, like myself, accepted it as simply another military objective. The delegation looked calculating, probably trying to determine if the odds could be improved. The Terran representatives. The Terran representatives looked excited. Captain Martinez leaned forward in his chair. "General, what kind of defenses are we looking at?" "Unknown," replied. "The construct appears to be shielded by some form of energy barrier that prevents detailed scanning. We know it exists, we know approximately what it's doing, but we have no intelligence about its specific capabilities or weaknesses." For a commander, this would represent an unacceptable level of uncertainty. We would spend weeks or months gathering intelligence before attempting any operation. But Martinez was already asking follow-up questions about fleet composition and deployment strategies. "How soon can we launch?" he asked. "Are you volunteering for a suicide mission, Captain?" asked General with what I thought might be amusement. "Sir, with respect, my Marines have been fighting the Vex longer than anyone else in this room. If there's a way to hurt these things, we'll find it. And if there isn't a way," Martinez shrugged. "Well, Sarah always said that sometimes you have to do something stupid on purpose." Protocol 7 again. I was beginning to understand that for humans, impossibility was less of an obstacle than it was a challenge. Over the next several days, our joint task force was expanded to include every available military asset. Dreadnoughts, stealth frigates, Terran assault carriers, and ships from a dozen other species. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history, all focused on a single target. I was assigned to the command ship, working directly with the integrated human tactical team that would coordinate the assault. This meant working closely with Martinez and the surviving members of its original unit. What I discovered was that these Marines had developed their own unique perspective on impossible odds. They planned for them. The thing about fighting the Vex, explained Sergeant Williams during one of our strategy sessions, is that your first plan never works. Neither does your second plan or your third. What you need is a plan that works when all your plans have failed. This was a fundamentally different approach from military doctrine. We created detailed plans with multiple contingencies, but the assumption was that one of those contingencies would prove correct. The human approach seemed to assume that all contingencies would fail and focused on creating flexibility to respond to complete surprises. "So what do you do when everything has gone wrong?" I asked. "Anything that works," Martinez replied. "The Vex are logical, but logic only takes you so far when you're fighting someone who's willing to ignore logic entirely." I was struggling to understand this concept when Williams offered an example. Back on 442, when the Vex had us surrounded and cut off from support, Commander ordered us to fix bayonets and charge their heaviest concentration. By every tactical manual ever written, it was suicide. We should have been wiped out in seconds. "But you weren't." "No, because the Vex had calculated that we would try to break out at their weakest point. They had positioned their forces to counter logical escape attempts. They weren't prepared for an illogical attack on their strongest position." Williams paused, looking thoughtful. "The thing is, knew it was suicide when she gave the order. But she also knew that if we were going to die anyway, we might as well die in a way that gave the mission a chance of success." This was the concept I had been struggling with since 3. These humans weren't fearless. They were afraid, sometimes terrified, but they acted anyway. And somehow that made them more effective in combat than warriors who felt no fear at all. As our fleet approached Vex space, I found myself observing the human crew members more closely. Unlike the personnel who maintained strict professional demeanor at all times, the humans displayed their emotions openly. I could see fear in their faces, but also determination, and something else I was learning to recognize. Hope. They genuinely believed they could succeed, despite odds that any rational analysis would classify as hopeless. It wasn't naivety. They understood the dangers better than anyone. It was something deeper than logic. It was faith. The first sign that our mission was going to be more difficult than expected came when we reached the outer edge of Vex territory. Long-range sensors detected a defensive perimeter unlike anything we had encountered before. Instead of individual ships or installations, the Vex had constructed a network of interconnected platforms that functioned as a single, massive weapon system. "It's like a spider web," observed Commander Torres, the fleet's chief tactical officer. "And we're the flies." The defensive network stretched across multiple star systems, with each platform capable of targeting vessels at extreme range. Approaching the construct would require penetrating layer after layer of coordinated defenses, each one designed to eliminate intruders using different methods. "Recommendations?" asked Admiral no relation to Sarah, but carrying the same determination in her bearing. The tactical team proposed a methodical approach. Concentrate firepower on individual platforms, eliminate them one by one, and advance systematically through the network. It was sound doctrine that would minimize casualties and ensure steady progress. The human team had a different suggestion. "We punch through," Martinez said simply. "All ships maximum speed straight for the construct. Don't stop to fight the platforms, just get past them as quickly as possible." "Captain, that approach would result in massive casualties," objected General. "We would lose 70% of our fleet in the first wave alone." "Maybe," Martinez agreed. "But the ships that make it through would arrive at the construct with enough firepower to complete the mission. The methodical approach might save more ships in the short term, but it gives the Vex time to adapt and develop new countermeasures." He gestured to the tactical display. "Every minute we spend fighting their defenses is time they're using to study our capabilities and prepare responses. We've seen this pattern before. The longer an engagement lasts, the more advantages shift to the Vex." It was the same choice we had faced on 3, scaled up to fleet level. Accept certain heavy losses in exchange for maintaining the element of surprise and momentum. Admiral studied the projections for a long moment. Finally, she turned to me. "You've worked with both tactical approaches. What's your assessment?" I had been dreading this question because I knew my answer would go against every principle of military doctrine. But my experiences with the humans had taught me to value effectiveness over doctrine. The human approach has a higher probability of mission success, I said. Methods would preserve more ships, but would likely result in mission failure as the Vex adapt to our tactics. Around the room, I could see the shock on the faces of my fellow officers. I was advocating for a plan that would deliberately sacrifice thousands of lives on the possibility that it might work better than a careful, methodical approach. But I had seen what human methods could accomplish when everything else failed. Admiral nodded slowly. Then we punch through. All ships prepare for maximum acceleration assault. We have one chance to catch them off guard, let's not waste it. The next few hours were spent in frantic preparation. Ship crews made final equipment checks. Tactical teams finalized targeting priorities, and everyone tried not to think too hard about the probability that most of us would not survive the next day. I found Martinez in the human section of the ship, talking quietly with his Marines. They were sharing photographs of home, writing letters they hoped someone else would deliver, and engaging in the same strange rituals I had observed before previous missions. "Are you afraid?" I asked him. Martinez looked up from a letter he was writing. "Terrified," he said honestly. "This whole plan is insane. We're going to lose a lot of good people." "Then why do it?" "Because Commander was right," he replied. "Sometimes you have to do something stupid on purpose. The smart move, the safe move, the logical move, those are the ones the Vex expect. They've been studying us for months, learning our patterns. The only way to surprise them is to do something that makes no tactical sense." He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "Besides, if we don't try, everyone dies anyway. At least this way we get to go down swinging." I was beginning to understand that this was what humans called hope. Not the expectation of success, but the refusal to accept defeat. The determination to keep fighting even when logic suggested there was no point. The assault began at 600 Standard Time. 237 ships from 17 different species launched themselves at the Vex defensive network at maximum speed, abandoning all pretense of caution or tactical sophistication. The first platform opened fire when we were still 3 hours away. Energy beams that could slice through heavy armor tracked across our formation, targeting command ships and carriers with devastating accuracy. We lost 12 ships in the first volley. "All ships maintain course and speed," Admiral broadcast. "Do not break formation to engage the platforms. Our target is the construct." It was harder than it sounded. Every military instinct screamed to return fire, to engage the threats that were killing our comrades. But the human approach required discipline of a different kind, the discipline to ignore immediate threats in service of a larger objective. We lost more ships as we pushed deeper into the network. Vex platforms unleashed weapons we had never seen before, energy fields that simply disintegrated matter at the molecular level, gravity manipulators that crushed ships like aluminum cans, and stranger things that I couldn't even describe. By the time we reached the construct, our fleet had been reduced to 63 ships. We had lost nearly 75% of our forces in exactly the way the tactical projections had predicted. But we had surprised them. The Vex had prepared defenses for a methodical assault, not a desperate charge. Their platforms were optimized for long-range engagement, not for dealing with enemies that were willing to absorb massive casualties to close distance. The construct itself was even more disturbing up close than it had appeared in the intelligence images. It pulsed with organic rhythms, its surface crawling with activity that suggested life, but followed no biological patterns I could recognize. Weapon ports opened and closed like breathing orifices, and the entire structure seemed to be watching us with malevolent intelligence. "All ships commence bombardment," Admiral ordered. "Target any structure that looks like it might be important." What followed was the most intense combat I had ever experienced. The construct's defenses were unlike anything we had encountered, not individual weapons, but a coordinated system that responded to our attacks like a living immune system. Every time we destroyed one section, other sections adapted to counter our tactics. But we adapted too, not through careful analysis or tactical planning, but through the kind of desperate improvisation the humans had perfected. When directed energy weapons proved ineffective against certain sections, we switched to kinetic projectiles. When the construct's defenses adapted to those, we began using our ships themselves as weapons. Captain Martinez was the first to ram his ship into the construct's surface. His escort carrier, badly damaged and unable to maintain formation, accelerated directly into what appeared to be a major weapon cluster. The explosion tore a massive hole in the construct's outer shell and revealed the organic machinery beneath. All ships with critical damage consider ramming attacks on exposed sections, Admiral broadcast. If you're going to lose your ship anyway, make it count. It was a terrifying order, but completely logical in the human sense. Ships that were doomed anyway could still contribute to the mission by maximizing the damage they inflicted. I watched as 16 more vessels followed Martinez's example, their crews voluntarily flying into certain death to create opportunities for the remaining ships. Each impact revealed more of the construct's internal structure and provided targeting data for the surviving vessels. Admiral called over the comm. "I need someone to coordinate ground assault. The bombardment isn't enough. We need teams inside the construct to target critical systems." It was another suicide mission. The construct's interior would be swarming with Vex defenders, and anyone who went in would have no way out. But it was also the only way to ensure the mission succeeded. "I volunteer for ground assault command," I said. "Negative," came Martinez's voice. Apparently his ship had survived the ramming attack, though barely. "This is a job for Marines. We're better at the up-close stuff." "Captain, your ship." "My ship is dead in space, but the launch bays still work. My Marines can get inside the construct, but will need support to handle the heavy defensive systems." It was a compromise that made tactical sense. Human flexibility combined with firepower, working together in the most dangerous environment we could imagine. The assault shuttles launched from our damaged ships directly into the holes torn by the ramming attacks. I found myself crammed into a human transport with 12 Marines, all of us wearing improvised environmental suits and carrying every weapon we could carry. "What's the plan?" I asked Martinez as our shuttle approached the construct's surface. "Same as always," he replied. "Get inside, break everything we can reach, and try not to die before the job's done." "That's not a plan," I protested. "That's barely even a strategy." "Welcome to Protocol 7, Martinez said with a grin that didn't hide his terror. "Sometimes stupid is all you've got." The interior of the construct was worse than our worst nightmares. Organic corridors pulsed with alien life, gravity shifted without warning, and the very air seemed to be trying to poison us. Vex defenders emerged from surfaces that had appeared solid, attacked in swarms that followed no recognizable tactics, and adapted to our responses almost instantly. But the Marines moved through this nightmare environment like they were taking a walk through a park. They had spent months learning to fight in impossible conditions, and this was just another impossible condition. "Left here," Martinez called out, apparently navigating by some system I couldn't comprehend. "Should be a major processing center about 200 meters ahead." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because that's where I'd put it," he replied. "The Vex are logical, remember? They just use a different kind of logic than we do." The processing center turned out to be exactly where Martinez predicted, a vast chamber filled with organic machinery that was clearly creating new Vex forms. Thousands of gestation pods lined the walls, each one containing partially formed creatures designed for purposes I didn't want to imagine. "Charges set," called Sergeant Williams. "But we've got a problem. The construct is adapting to our presence faster than expected. Those pods are accelerating their development cycles." Around the chamber, I could see Vex forms that were only partially developed beginning to move. Some were emerging from their pods weeks ahead of schedule, driven by the construct's desperate need to defend itself. "How long until the charges detonate?" Martinez asked. 90 seconds, Williams replied. "And how long until those things finish developing?" Williams looked at the readouts on his scanner. "About 60 seconds. I could see the calculation in Martinez's face. If we tried to retreat immediately, the emerging Vex would be able to disarm the charges before they detonated. If we stayed to ensure the charges exploded, we would be trapped with hundreds of hostile creatures in an enclosed space. It was the same choice humans seemed to face in every critical situation. Do the smart thing that ensured personal survival, or do the necessary thing that ensured mission success. "All teams fall back to extraction points," Martinez ordered. "We'll hold here until the charges blow." "Captain, that's suicide," protested one of the Marines. Yeah, Martinez agreed. Commander always said the job comes first. As the other teams began retreating, our group took defensive positions around the processing center. The emerging Vex forms were incomplete, but still dangerous creatures of fang and claw and stranger things that had no names in any language I knew. For 60 seconds, we held that chamber against increasing numbers of enemies that were literally being born to kill us. We used every weapon we carried, then used the weapons as clubs when we ran out of ammunition. We used our fists when the weapons broke, and used our bodies as shields when nothing else would work. I remember thinking, as a Vex form twice my size tried to tear my armor apart, that this was what it meant about fear. I was terrified, absolutely convinced that I was about to die, but I was still fighting. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because being afraid didn't matter as much as completing the mission. The charges detonated exactly on schedule, and the processing center collapsed around us. The explosion tore through multiple levels of the construct, creating a chain reaction that began destroying other critical systems. Somehow, impossibly, 3 of us survived. Myself, Martinez, and Marine Williams, all badly injured but still alive in the wreckage of the chamber. "Status report," Martinez called over the comm, his voice weak but determined. "Multiple critical systems destroyed," came Admiral's voice. "The construct is losing power and beginning to collapse. All ground teams, immediate extraction to any available pickup point." We made our way through corridors that were literally falling apart around us, guided by emergency lighting and pure stubborn determination. The construct's death throes were spectacular and terrifying, organic walls convulsing, gravity fields fluctuating wildly, and the sound of massive structures tearing themselves apart. We reached an extraction point just as the final cascade failure began. The pickup shuttle was already overloaded with survivors from other teams, but the pilot somehow found room for 3 more passengers. As we lifted away from the construct's surface, I watched through the shuttle's viewport as the entire structure collapsed in on itself. The chain reaction we had started consumed everything: the production facilities, the defensive systems, the Vex forces guarding it, and whatever intelligence had been controlling the whole operation. The war wasn't over. There were still Vex forces scattered throughout the galaxy, but we had cut off their ability to replace losses or adapt to new situations. Without the central construct, they would eventually be defeated by conventional forces. We had won. The cost had been enormous. Of the 237 ships that had begun the assault, only 18 survived. Of the thousands of ground assault troops, fewer than 200 made it to extraction points. By any reasonable measure, it had been a military disaster. But it had also been a complete victory. Later, as I sat in the shuttle's medical bay having my injuries treated, Martinez asked me a question that I'm still thinking about. He said, "Were you afraid in there?" I considered lying. Admitting fear went against everything I had been taught about honor and military bearing. But these humans had taught me that there was honor in a different kind of truth. "Yes," I said, "I was terrified." Martinez nodded. "Good. Fear kept you alive long enough to do your job. That's what it's for." For the first time, I began to understand what Commander had been trying to tell me about courage. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in spite of fear. And maybe, just maybe, that was a lesson worth learning. Even if it had taken a war against impossible odds to teach it to me. 6 months after the destruction of the Vex construct, I found myself in a position I had never expected, teaching human combat techniques to military cadets. The irony was not lost on me. For 3, the Empire had been teaching other species how to wage war. We were the acknowledged masters of military strategy, tactics, and technology. Now, our finest military academy was requiring courses in human methodology as part of standard officer training. "The key principle," I explained to a class of young warriors, "is adaptive improvisation under stress. When your primary plan fails, instead of falling back to predetermined contingencies, you create new options using available resources." One of the cadets, a promising student from a distinguished military family, raised his hand. "Instructor, this approach seems to deliberately introduce chaos into military operations. How can chaos lead to victory?" It was a good question, and one that I had struggled with myself. How do you explain to a species that values order and logic that sometimes the best solution is to abandon order entirely? Consider this scenario, I said, activating the holographic display. Your unit is surrounded by superior forces with better equipment and tactical position. Standard doctrine would call for defensive positioning while calling for reinforcements. The display showed a typical tactical situation, the kind every cadet had studied dozens of times. But what if no reinforcements are available? What if defensive positioning only delays inevitable defeat? Then we die with honor, replied immediately. It was the correct answer according to traditional values. The humans would disagree, I said. They would look for a third option, something that changes the fundamental nature of the engagement. I modified the display to show the same tactical situation, but with human-style solutions overlaid on the traditional ones. Instead of defending or attacking predictable targets, they might attack their own position to deny it to the enemy. Instead of preserving equipment, they might overload power systems to create improvised weapons. Instead of following military protocol, they might pretend to surrender and then detonate hidden explosives. The class looked disturbed by these suggestions. To young minds, such tactics seemed dishonorable, unprofessional, or simply insane. But instructor, another cadet asked, wouldn't such methods lead to unnecessary casualties among our own forces? Often, yes, I admitted. Human tactics frequently result in higher immediate casualty rates than conventional approaches, but they also frequently result in mission success when conventional approaches would guarantee failure. I paused, thinking about how to explain something that had taken me months of combat experience to understand. The humans have a phrase, better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. They would rather accept heavy losses while achieving objectives than preserve forces while failing missions. This was the fundamental difference between human and military philosophy. We planned to minimize losses. They planned to maximize effectiveness, regardless of cost. After the class ended, I walked through the academy grounds and reflected on how much my perspective had changed. The carefully maintained gardens and precisely ordered buildings that had once represented the pinnacle of civilization now seemed almost naive. There was beauty in order, but there was power in chaos that I had never appreciated before. My communicator chimed with an incoming message from Admiral. She had survived the Construct assault and been promoted to head of Joint Species Military Operations. Essentially, the galaxy's top military commander. I need you back in the field. We've got a situation that requires your particular expertise. The situation turned out to be more complex than a simple military operation. In the 6 months since the destruction of the Vex construct, scattered Vex forces throughout the galaxy had been evolving independently. Without central coordination, they were developing in unexpected directions. Most of these isolated groups had been relatively easy to eliminate using conventional forces. But 3 separate populations had begun exhibiting behaviors that all previous understanding of Vex psychology. They had started communicating. The first contact occurred in the Rigel system, Admiral explained, as we reviewed intelligence reports aboard her flagship. Local defense forces were preparing to clear out a Vex holdout when the Vex transmitted a message. She played the recording. The Vex communication was unlike anything in their previous behavior, not the coordinated hive mind signals we had detected before, but something that resembled actual language. What did they say? I asked. That's the problem. We don't know. The message was in no language or communication protocol in our databases, but it followed patterns that suggest structured information exchange rather than simple threat display. This was disturbing for several reasons. The Vex had never demonstrated individual communication before. They had operated as a collective intelligence with perfect coordination, but no apparent individuality. If isolated groups were developing independent communication, it suggested they were becoming something entirely new. Where do I fit into this? I asked. Admiral smiled, and I recognized the expression. It was the same look Sarah had worn when she was about to suggest something dangerous and probably insane. You're going to make first contact, she said. You and a human diplomatic team. If these Vex are trying to communicate, we need to find out what they want before we decide whether to destroy them or try to coexist. The concept of diplomatic contact with the Vex was so far outside normal military thinking that it took me several seconds to process the implications. Admiral, with respect, the Vex have shown no previous indication of peaceful intentions. Every encounter has resulted in combat. Every encounter so far, Admiral agreed. But these new groups might be different. The destruction of the construct seems to have freed them from whatever central control was driving their aggressive behavior. She brought up tactical displays showing the 3 locations where Vex groups had attempted communication. All were in systems with minimal human presence, frontier worlds with small colonies or research stations. The pattern suggests they're specifically seeking contact with isolated human populations, she continued. Not attacking, not infiltrating, but trying to establish dialogue. Why humans specifically? Admiral looked thoughtful. Best guess, because humans are the species they understand least. Every other race they encountered followed predictable patterns. Humans consistently acted in ways that violated their strategic models. I began to understand the logic. The Vex had been a collective intelligence optimized for understanding and countering logical threats. Humans represented something outside their comprehension, a force that succeeded through illogical methods. If they're trying to understand us, I said slowly, then they might be trying to learn something that their original programming couldn't accommodate. Exactly, and that might represent an opportunity for peaceful coexistence, or it might represent a new kind of threat that we need to identify before it spreads. The diplomatic mission was assembled with typical human disregard for conventional wisdom. Instead of a large, heavily armed fleet designed to project power, Admiral authorized a single fast cruiser with minimal weaponry and maximum sensor capability. If we're trying to establish peaceful contact, she explained, then showing up with a battle fleet sends the wrong message. The human diplomatic team was led by Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who had spent her career studying non-human communication patterns. Her approach to first contact protocols was as unconventional as everything else about human methodology. The standard procedure is to establish basic mathematical concepts, then build up to more complex ideas, she explained as we traveled toward the Rigel system. But the Vex already demonstrated mathematical understanding in their previous behavior. They built complex technology and coordinated massive operations. What they seem to lack is comprehension of individual motivation. How do you communicate individual motivation to a collective intelligence? I asked. You show them what it looks like, Dr. Santos replied. Not through abstract concepts, but through direct demonstration. Her plan was characteristically human in its simplicity and audacity. Instead of trying to establish formal diplomatic contact, we would simply approach the Vex position and wait to see what they did. No weapons, no threats, no demands, just presence and availability for communication. And if they attack, I asked, then we find out if they've learned anything new since the construct was destroyed, Dr. Santos said calmly. The Vex holdout in the Rigel system had taken up position on an asteroid mining facility that had been abandoned during their initial invasion. As our cruiser approached, we could see that they had modified the facility extensively, but not in the way we expected. Instead of the typical Vex conversion to organic architecture, the facility retained its original structural design but had been enhanced with systems that seemed to serve no military purpose. Gardens, recreation areas, what appeared to be individual living spaces. They're building a habitat, observed Captain, our ship's commander. Not a military installation, not a production facility, a place to live. This was unprecedented. The Vex had never shown interest in comfort, recreation, or individual space. Their previous installations had been purely functional, optimized for production or defense with no consideration for quality of life. New contact, announced our communications officer. They're transmitting again. The message was similar to the previous recordings, but Dr. Santos immediately noticed differences in structure and complexity. It's more sophisticated than the earlier attempts, she said. They're using recursive patterns that suggest self-reference. They might be trying to establish individual identity markers. Can you respond? I asked. Not in any language they would recognize, Dr. Santos replied, but I can try something else. She began transmitting a simple sequence mathematical progressions, then musical patterns, then visual designs that followed emotional rather than logical structures. It was less like language and more like art. The Vex response was immediate and surprising. Instead of returning mathematical patterns, they transmitted something that resembled music. Not human music, but something with rhythm and variation that seemed to be expressing emotion rather than data. "They're trying to communicate feelings," Dr. Santos said with amazement. "Not facts or intentions, but actual emotional states." For the next several hours, we engaged in the strangest diplomatic session in galactic history. The Vex would transmit patterns that seemed to represent different emotional concepts, and Dr. Santos would respond with human artistic expressions that conveyed similar feelings. Joy, sadness, fear, hope, wonder. Gradually, a picture began to emerge. These Vex were not the collective intelligence that had threatened the galaxy. They were individuals who had been freed from collective control and were experiencing independent consciousness for the first time. They were afraid. Not afraid of us, but afraid of themselves. They had spent their entire existence as part of a larger whole, thinking collective thoughts and pursuing collective goals. Now they were alone with their own minds, struggling to understand what individual existence meant. "They want to know if they can trust us," Dr. Santos said after several hours of communication. "And more importantly, they want to know if they can trust themselves." It was a profound question. Could creatures that had been designed as weapons of conquest learn to exist peacefully? Could collective intelligence be transformed into individual consciousness without losing something essential in the process? "What should we tell them?" Captain asked. I found myself thinking about my own transformation over the past months. 6 months ago, I had been a warrior who understood the world in terms of order, logic, and overwhelming force. My encounters with humans had taught me that there were other ways to understand existence, ways that involved uncertainty, improvisation, and the willingness to act despite incomplete information. If I could learn to think differently, perhaps these Vex could as well. "Tell them," I said, "that trust isn't something you know, it's something you choose." Dr. Santos looked at me with surprise, but she transmitted a pattern that seemed to convey the concept of choice as distinct from knowledge. The Vex response was immediate and powerful, a complex transmission that felt like confusion and hope and determination all mixed together. "I think," Dr. Santos said quietly, "they just asked us to help them learn how to be individuals." The next phase of the mission involved something that had never been attempted in galactic history: teaching former enemies how to live peacefully, not through conquest or subjugation, but through voluntary cooperation. Admiral authorized the establishment of a joint research station in the Rigel system, staffed by human behavioral scientists, sociologists, and volunteers from a dozen other species. The goal was to study the transformation of collective consciousness into individual awareness and to help the process along where possible. I found myself serving as a liaison between the research team and the transforming Vex. My experience with adaptation and change apparently qualified me as an expert in personal transformation, a role I had never expected to fill. The first breakthrough came when one of the Vex, who had chosen the name Harmony for individual identification, asked me about fear. "We observe that humans and both experience fear but respond differently," Harmony said through the translation system we had developed. "Attempt to eliminate fear through preparation and discipline. Humans accept fear as part of decision-making, which approach is correct." It was a remarkably sophisticated question from a creature that had only existed as an individual for a few weeks, but it also cut to the heart of something I was still learning myself. "Both approaches have value," I said, "but I think the human approach might be more useful for individuals." "Explain." I considered how to put my thoughts into words that could be translated into Vex conceptual frameworks. "Fear provides information," I said. "It tells you when a situation is dangerous or uncertain. If you eliminate fear completely, you lose access to that information. But if fear controls your decisions, you become paralyzed by uncertainty. So the optimal approach is to experience fear, but not be controlled by it. Yes, fear should inform your choices, not make your choices." Harmony was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her translated words carried what seemed like wonder. "This is very different from collective existence. In the collective, there was no fear because there was no individual risk. If one unit was lost, the collective continued unchanged. But individual existence means individual risk. It also means individual choice, I pointed out, and individual achievement. Over the following months, I watched the transformed Vex grapple with concepts that most species took for granted. Individual identity, personal relationships, private thoughts, and the whole complex web of emotions and motivations that drove individual behavior. They learned remarkably quickly. Within 6 months, the Rigel group had established their own social structures, cultural practices, and even artistic expressions. They were no longer Vex in any meaningful sense. They had become something entirely new. The other two groups showed similar development patterns, though each was evolving in slightly different directions. The group near Tau was developing a society based on scientific inquiry and technological innovation. The group in the Vega system was focusing on agricultural development and what appeared to be philosophical contemplation. All three groups maintained regular communication with each other and with the Joint Research Station. They were building a new kind of civilization, one based on individual choice rather than collective programming. But the most significant development came 9 months after first contact, when Harmony asked me a question that changed everything. She said during one of our regular conversations, "We have been discussing a proposal among our community. We would like to request formal membership in the Galactic Council." The implications were staggering. Former enemies seeking to join the government as equals. Creatures that had been designed as weapons of conquest asking to participate in democratic governance. "Are you certain you're ready for that responsibility?" I asked. "We are certain we are ready to try," Harmony replied, "which we have learned is the only certainty that individuals can ever have." It was a very human answer, and I realized that these transformed Vex had learned more from their contact with humans than anyone had expected. They had learned not just how to be individuals, but how to embrace the uncertainty that individual existence required. The formal request was submitted to the Galactic Council 3 months later. The debate that followed was unprecedented in galactic history. How do you evaluate membership applications from former enemies who had fundamentally changed their nature? I was called to testify before the Council as an expert witness on both the transformation process and the character of the applicants. Standing before representatives of 17 different species, I found myself advocating for creatures that I had once fought against with everything I had. "The evidence suggests," I told the assembled council members, "that these transformed Vex represent something entirely new in galactic history. They have voluntarily abandoned aggressive behavior, adopted individual consciousness, and demonstrated commitment to peaceful coexistence." "But can we trust them?" asked the representative. "How do we know this isn't some elaborate deception?" It was a fair question, and one that I had wrestled with myself. How do you verify the sincerity of creatures who had once been the galaxy's greatest threat? "We can't know," I replied. "Trust isn't something you can prove or verify. It's something you choose to grant based on observed behavior and demonstrated commitment." I paused, thinking about everything I had learned from my contact with humans. 6 months ago, I would have said that trust must be earned through logical demonstration of reliability. But human methodology has taught me that sometimes you have to take risks based on hope rather than certainty. "And what does human methodology suggest in this case?" asked Admiral, who was present as a council observer. "That we give them a chance," I said. "Not because we know they'll succeed, but because the possibility of success is worth the risk of failure." The vote was close, but the council ultimately approved provisional membership for all 3 transformed Vex communities. They would be granted full membership rights after a probationary period during which their behavior and development would be closely monitored. Harmony transmitted their community's response to the decision, and even through the translation system, the emotion was unmistakable. Joy, gratitude, and determination all mixed together in a pattern that needed no words to understand. But perhaps the most significant moment came during the formal ceremony where the new member species were welcomed into the council. As Harmony stepped forward to accept the membership charter, she said something that captured everything I had learned about courage, fear, and the choices that define who we are. We choose to join this council not because we are certain we will succeed as individuals and as a society, but because we are certain that the attempt to succeed is worth making. We have learned that the greatest courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear in service of something larger than ourselves. As I listened to those words, I realized that this creature, this former enemy who had once existed only as part of a collective designed for destruction, had learned the most important lesson that humans had to teach. That individual existence meant individual choice, and individual choice meant taking responsibility for creating the future you wanted to live in, regardless of how uncertain or frightening that future might be. After the ceremony, I found myself walking through the council station's observation deck, looking out at the stars and thinking about how much had changed in the past year. A war that had seemed impossible to win had been won through methods that had seemed impossible to use. Enemies had become allies through transformations that had seemed impossible to achieve. Admiral joined me at the observation window. "Any regrets about the path we chose?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. The human approach had cost thousands of lives, required accepting risks that violated every principle of logical decision-making, and had led to outcomes that no one could have predicted. "No regrets," I said finally, "though I'm still not entirely sure I understand how it all worked." Admiral smiled. "That's the thing about doing something stupid on purpose. You don't have to understand it while you're doing it. You just have to trust that understanding will come later. And if it doesn't, then you try something else stupid and see if that works better." I laughed, recognizing the characteristically human response. But as I looked out at the stars, I realized that this approach to existence, this willingness to act without complete understanding, to take risks based on hope rather than certainty, had accomplished something that logic and careful planning could never have achieved. It had turned the galaxy's greatest threat into its hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important lesson of all. 3 months later, I received new orders that completed my transformation from traditional warrior to something entirely different. I was being assigned as the first interspecies military advisor, responsible for developing joint training programs that combine the best aspects of multiple species military traditions. My first assignment was to establish a new academy where young officers from every member species would learn not just their own traditions, but the traditions of others. They would study discipline and stealth and human adaptability and Vex collective coordination techniques, now being applied to voluntary cooperation rather than conquest. The goal was to create military officers who could think beyond the limitations of their own species' perspectives. Officers who could improvise when their training failed them, who could adapt when their enemies surprised them, and who could choose hope over certainty when the situation demanded it. As I stood in the empty halls of the new academy, preparing for the arrival of the first class of interspecies cadets, I thought about Commander Sarah and the lesson she had taught me about courage. She had been right. Real courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in spite of fear in service of something larger than yourself. But I had learned something else from my time fighting alongside humans. Real courage was also the willingness to change, to abandon old ways of thinking when they stopped serving you, to embrace uncertainty when certainty had failed, and to trust in the possibility of becoming something better than what you had been before. And perhaps most importantly, real courage was the recognition that the greatest battles weren't always fought against external enemies. Sometimes they were fought against your own limitations, your own assumptions, and your own fears about what you might become if you allowed yourself to change. The humans had taught me that it was possible to win both kinds of battles, not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that defeat was inevitable. As the first transport ships approached the academy, carrying cadets from 18 different species who would learn to fight together rather than against each other, I felt something I had never experienced before as a warrior. I felt hope. Not certainty, not confidence in a predetermined outcome, but the kind of hope that humans specialized in the belief that the future could be better than the present, if you were willing to work for it and sacrifice for it, and sometimes do stupid things on purpose in service of it. It wasn't the way I had been trained to think, but then the best lessons rarely came from training. They came from experience and choice, and the willingness to trust that fear was information rather than instruction. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they came from fighting alongside creatures who were crazy enough to charge into impossible odds, while screaming battle cries that made no tactical sense, but somehow made perfect human sense. The academy doors opened, and the future began. It was going to be interesting.